She saw the tire marks before she saw the car. 2 black streaks cut across the wet road, stretched to where the guardrail had been torn open, then vanished into the darkness below. Rain was still falling. She had just finished a 12-hour shift at the clinic. So exhausted, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. But those 2 black streaks would not let her drive past. She pulled over, turned on her flashlight, climbed down the embankment and found the girl inside an overturned SUV, unconscious, her left arm bent at an angle that was not natural. A deep gash across her forehead, blood already dried in a streak down her temple. No cell signal. Nearly 10 kilometers in each direction without a single house. The temperature outside was dropping below 5 degrees. The 27-year-old nurse had nothing but an old jacket, a first aid kit half the size of her palm, and a decision that took her less than 3 seconds to make. Stay. She did not know who the unconscious girl was, did not know that the girl's brother was the man the entire East Coast underworld called by a single name, and did not know that this night, the night she sat in mud and rain, holding a complete stranger warm, would be the night that began to bring down an empire. This story will show you that sometimes, one small act from a person who has nothing can shake an entire world that money and power could never reach. If you are new to this channel, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. And now, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? But to understand why that nurse did not take more than 3 seconds to decide to stay in the nighttime woods with a stranger, we have to go back a few hours earlier, to the small clinic at the end of the main road, in the town of Cumberland, Maryland, where June Bellamy had just finished her 12th consecutive shift of the week. The clinic had only 2 medical staff members, and on the night shift there was only her. They had run out of pain medication at the beginning of the week. The bandages were being rationed roll by roll, and the blood pressure machine had had a broken button since last month, with no money yet to replace it. The final case of that night was an old man who came in clutching his chest, his face gone a pale gray. June sat him down, checked his pulse with 2 fingers, asked exactly 3 questions to assess his condition, then did what she could with what she had, keeping him stable until the ambulance from the county hospital arrived 40 minutes later. When the ambulance pulled away, she stood in the clinic doorway and watched the red lights blinking farther and farther into the dark road, then turned back inside to clean up alone. She was used to it, used to being the only person left in the room when everything that needed doing still wasn't done, used to it long before she even knew this clinic existed. June Bellamy lost her parents in a fire when she was little. She doesn't remember much about that night, only the smell of smoke and the hand of a neighbor pulling her out through the back door. After that came the foster care system. Many different families, many different rooms, and not one of them was hers. She learned earlier than most people her age that nobody was obligated to stay, and that if you wanted anything, you had to go get it yourself. At 18, she aged out of the system and worked every kind of job she could to support herself, waiting tables, cleaning hotel rooms, helping in kitchens, and eventually finding her way into healthcare not because of any grand dream, but because she discovered that she was good at staying calm when other people panicked, and that skill turned out to have value in places where nobody wanted to work. Her shift ended a little before 11 o'clock at night. June locked the clinic door and stepped out into the parking lot. Rain had begun to fall, light at first, then steadily heavier. She got into her old car, the one whose heater worked only on one side, and whose windshield wipers made a creaking sound every time they dragged across the glass. She pulled onto the main road and turned toward the mountain pass on the way home. The road at night was empty, black forest on both sides, rain turning the pavement slick with water. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not because she was afraid, but because she was tired. The kind of tired that belongs to someone who has spent 12 hours on her feet, handled everything alone, and knows tomorrow will be exactly the same. At that moment, her mind held nothing but numbers. 2 months behind on rent. The landlord had called twice last week, polite the first time, not polite the second. The clinic was about to shut down for lack of funding. The management had sent notice the month before. And if the clinic closed, she would lose her job. And if she lost her job, rent would no longer be a matter of being 2 months late, but of having no month to pay at all. But June wasn't the kind of person who sat around thinking about things she couldn't control. She thought about tomorrow's shift, about the list of medication that needed to be reordered, about the blood pressure machine with the broken button that she might be able to fix herself if she found the right part. She thought about the things she could do, because that was how she had lived for 27 years. One day at a time, one task at a time, never looking farther than what her own 2 hands could reach. The rain came down harder. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up. The mountain road curved sharply. She slowed down and switched on the high beams. And then she saw 2 black streaks cutting across the wet road, stretching toward a guardrail that had been torn open, and then disappearing into the darkness below. June doesn't remember exactly how she climbed down into the roadside ditch. She only remembers the ground slipping under her feet, the rain striking her face, and the beam of her flashlight sweeping across the overturned vehicle below like a dead animal lying in the brush. She slid down, grabbing at roots jutting out of the earth, and by the time she reached the SUV, her knees were coated in mud. The driver's side door was jammed. She had to crawl around to the other side, where the window had shattered, to get inside. The woman lay slumped sideways in the driver's seat, the seatbelt keeping her from falling out, but also digging into her left shoulder at a bad angle. June pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck, searching for a pulse. There, weak but steady. She let out a breath, then got to work. The woman's left arm wasn't moving, and June could tell at a glance that it wasn't something to touch, only something to keep still. She unfastened the seatbelt, eased the woman out of the vehicle slowly, and dragged her to the flattest patch of ground she could find beside a large tree, where the canopy above blocked at least some of the rain. She opened the first aid kit. Inside were 4 gauze pads, 1 small roll of bandage, a tube of antiseptic, and 1 pair of gloves. Not much, but June was used to working with less than that. She pressed gauze to the wound on the woman's forehead and held it there until the bleeding stopped, then wrapped it in place. For the left arm, she found 2 straight branches just long enough, tore a strip of fabric from the inner lining of her jacket, and secured the arm to the 2 branches to hold it in position. It wasn't pretty, but it was enough to keep the arm from shifting any farther. After the first aid was done, June sat back, looked down at the woman lying on the ground, then looked up toward the mountain road above. The rain was still falling, and the temperature was still dropping. She knew that if she climbed back up to the road and drove to find a place with phone service, it could take an hour or more. An hour in this cold, with a head injury and nothing to keep warm, could be an hour too long. June took off her outer coat and laid it over the woman, then sat with her back against the tree trunk and pulled the woman close against her body to share what warmth she had. The cold cut through the thin layer of clothing she had left on almost at once, but she didn't move. The woman woke for the first time about an hour later. Her eyes flew open. She dragged in a sharp breath like someone who had just been pulled up from underwater, and she began to struggle. June held her by the shoulder, gentle but firm, and spoke in the even, unhurried voice she used with panicked patients at the clinic. "I'm here. You're not alone. You were in a car accident. Your left arm is injured. I've stabilized it already. Don't move too much." The woman looked at June with wide, frightened eyes, not yet understanding what was happening. But June's voice was too steady, too calm, and the hand on her shoulder was too sure. So little by little the woman stopped struggling. Her eyes closed. She drifted off again. The second time the woman woke, the rain had grown lighter, but the cold had deepened. This time, she woke slowly, opened her eyes bit by bit, looked around, then looked at June. She asked in a hoarse voice, "Who are you?" June said, "Someone passing by." The woman studied June for another moment, looked at the thin clothing she wore, looked at the coat draped over herself, then asked, "Why didn't you go find help?" June said, "Because if I left, there'd be nobody to keep you warm." The woman fell silent. Her eyes lifted to the wet canopy above, where rainwater still slipped down through the leaves. She didn't say anything else, but her right hand, the one that could still move, slowly shifted to the side, searching for June's hand, and took hold of it. June let it stay there. The 2 of them sat that way in silence until the woman drifted off once more. The third time, dawn was near. The rain had stopped. The air was colder than it had been during the storm because the clouds were gone, and by then June was trembling from her shoulders to her feet. But she still sat in the same place, her back against the tree, the woman leaning against her. The woman opened her eyes, and this time she was more awake than before, looking at June with eyes that were no longer ruled by panic, but by something else. Something June recognized because she had seen it in the mirror many times. The eyes of someone who isn't used to anyone staying. The woman said, very softly, "Thank you." June did not answer. She only tightened her hand around the woman's just a little more, and sat there waiting for the daylight to come completely. While June sat trembling in the nighttime woods, holding a stranger close to keep her warm, more than 200 kilometers to the east, on the highest floor of the Lawson Maritime Building at the Port of Baltimore, a meeting was underway in a room no one entered unless summoned. The conference table was long, its surface dark wood, 8 chairs in all, but only 5 of them occupied. The man seated at the head of the table was not the one who spoke the most, but he was the only one every person in the room turned toward whenever a decision had to be made. Reed Lawson was 33 years old, with gray eyes that seemed to weigh every person they landed on. And the way he sat at the head of the table was not the posture of a man chairing a meeting, but of a man who owned the room, the building, and everything inside it. Beneath the table, a Neapolitan Mastiff lay sprawled across the stone floor, its head resting on its front paws, its eyes half closed, though its ears remained alert. The dog weighed nearly 70 kilograms, with a wrinkled face, a broad muzzle, and a coat the color of dark gray shadow. No one in the room looked at the dog for very long, not because it was vicious, but because everyone knew the animal obeyed only one man, and if that man was displeased, the dog would sense it before anyone else in the room did. Perry stood at Reed's right, presenting details about a shipment due to pass through the port the following week. Perry was the kind of man no one would look at twice on the street. Average build, ordinary face. Nothing remarkable about him, but that was exactly why he was good at this position, because no one remembered his face, and he remembered everyone else's. Perry finished his report and looked at Reed, waiting. Reed did not lift his gaze from the papers in front of him. He asked one short question about the figures. Perry answered. Reed nodded once. That was the end of it. The decision had been made in a matter of seconds without explanation, and no one at that table dared ask why. Lawson Maritime, from the outside, was a legitimate marine logistics company, licensed, established, complete with a website, a human resources department, and an accounting office. From the inside, it was the kind of thing everyone on the East Coast knew about, but no one mentioned unless they wanted trouble. Reed had not built this empire. His father had, Holt Lawson, the man who turned a small shipping company into a network the entire East Coast underworld had to reckon with. Reed had merely inherited it, but inherited it in such a way that no one ever doubted he had the strength to keep it. 15 years in command, not once losing control, not once making a decision that had to be taken back. In the underworld, people did not call him boss or kingpin. They simply said the name Lawson, and that was enough. The meeting ended. The 5 men stood, left the room one by one, and none of them lingered. Perry waited until the door had fully shut, until only 2 men and the dog remained, and then he spoke. There's one more thing. Reed looked up. Perry placed his phone on the table, opened a GPS tracking application, and turned the screen toward Reed. Noelle's car. The GPS signal was lost 6 hours ago. Last location was in the Appalachian Mountains, on a stretch of mountain road through the woods near Cumberland. Reed looked at the screen. He said nothing. His face did not change, but he stood up, and the way he stood was different from the way he had sat through the entire meeting. Faster. The mastiff beneath the table lifted its head at once, as though it had sensed the change in its master before Reed had spoken a single word. Perry did not need to ask anything. He had worked with Reed long enough to know when Reed was silent because he was thinking, and when Reed was silent because he had already made his decision. This was the second kind. Perry stepped out of the room, made the call, and had the car prepared. Noelle Lawson was Reed's half-sister, his father's daughter by another woman. Not many people knew this, and the ones who did never mentioned it in front of Reed. Their father had loved Noelle's mother before entering an arranged family marriage, and Noelle was the result of a relationship Holt Lawson had kept outside that official marriage for years. After his father died, Reed took responsibility for Noelle. But taking responsibility, in Reed's way, meant sending money every month without fail, placing a GPS tracker in her car without telling her, arranging for her to attend an art college in West Virginia, as far from Baltimore as possible, and never calling, unless it was necessary. Reed kept Noelle far away, because he told himself that was the safest way to protect her. But there was another part of it that he never said aloud, that every time he looked at Noelle, he saw her mother's face, and that face reminded him of what his father had chosen to abandon, of the man his father truly was, and thinking about that meant having to ask himself how much of that same man he was repeating. Reed walked out of the conference room, the Mastiff at his side, entered the elevator, and rode down to the parking garage. Perry had already started the black car and was waiting. Reed opened the rear door. The dog jumped in first, and Reed got in after it. The car pulled out of the Lawson Maritime building, turned onto the westbound highway, and headed toward the Appalachians, toward the final GPS point before the signal vanished, where, though Reed did not yet know it, a 27-year-old nurse was sitting in the nighttime woods, shivering violently, keeping his sister warm with the only coat she had. They reached the Cumberland Mountains just as dawn was beginning to break, that pale gray light of early morning after a night of rain, not enough to be called daylight, but enough to see the wet road glistening ahead. 2 black cars stopped on the stretch of mountain pass where the final GPS signal had appeared. Perry got out first, sweeping his gaze along both sides of the road, seeing nothing yet. Reed's men jumped out of the second vehicle, 4 of them, splitting into 2 directions to search, but the Mastiff was faster than all of them. The moment Reed opened the car door, the dog leaped onto the road, lowered its muzzle close to the ground, inhaled deeply 2 or 3 times, then moved straight toward the left side of the road, where a section of guardrail had been torn apart. The leash in Reed's hand tightened, pulling him in that direction. The dog did not hesitate, did not look back, did not need a command. It had caught the scent of something human eyes could not yet make out in the dim light. Reed loosened his grip to give the leash more length and followed. When he reached the broken guardrail, Reed looked down. The ditch was deeper than he had expected. Steep, the ground slick from the night rain, brush and exposed roots jutting out everywhere. The Mastiff had already started descending, its 4 legs gripping the wet earth with more certainty than any pair of shoes worn by the men above. Reed released the leash, letting the dog go first, then climbed down after it, holding onto roots exactly the way a few hours earlier a nurse had held onto them to make her way down this same slope. Perry called down from the road, "Let me go first." Reed did not turn back. He kept climbing. The Mastiff reached them first. Reed heard the dog stop, heard the familiar sound of its heavy breathing when it found the target, and then silence. The silence of a dog trained not to bark when it discovered someone. Reed stepped through the last patch of brush and saw them. The SUV lay overturned a few feet away, shattered glass scattered across the ground. But Reed did not look at the vehicle. He looked at the large tree beside it, where a woman was sitting with her back against the trunk, her legs stretched out in front of her, and against her body, his sister lay curled inside a coat that was clearly not the one belonging to the woman wearing it. The woman leaning against the tree had on nothing now but a thin shirt smeared with mud and soaked through. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, her lips were purple from the cold, but her arms were still holding Noelle close, and her right hand rested on Noelle's back in the exact place any person with medical knowledge would recognize as the place to monitor breathing. The Mastiff walked toward the 2 women, stopped about an arm's length away, and sat down, watching. It did not growl, it did not wag its tail. It only sat and watched, as though it understood that this woman was not a threat. The woman lifted her head when she heard footsteps. She looked at Reed, looked at the dog, looked at the group of men climbing down into the ditch behind him. She did not panic. She did not call for help. She did not cry. She said, in a voice hoarse from the cold but even and clear with every word, the voice of someone reporting a patient's condition, rather than the voice of someone who had spent the whole night sitting in mud and rain in the woods. "She has injuries to her left arm and head. I stabilized them as best I could. She needs to be taken to the hospital immediately." She woke up 3 times during the night. Her awareness was present but not stable. Her body temperature has dropped too low. She needs to be warmed before transport. Reed stood there and looked at her. He had seen every kind of person in the 15 years since taking over the empire his father left behind. People loyal because of fear. People loyal because of money. People willing to risk their lives because they had nothing left to lose. People who did everything for power. But he had never seen this kind. A woman sitting in a freezing forest through the night, shaking violently, blue with cold, giving her only coat to a stranger, staying awake the whole night, and when she was found, not saying "save me," but saying she needs a hospital. Reed looked at her longer than necessary. Then he turned to Perry, who was standing behind him, and said 2 words. "Ambulance." Perry made the call at once. 2 of Reed's men climbed down and carefully lifted Noelle onto a temporary stretcher. June stood up, unsteady, her legs numb after hours of sitting in one position, but she did not let anyone help her. She braced herself against the tree trunk, stood upright on her own, then followed the stretcher up the slope. The Mastiff walked beside her the entire way back up, and no one had told it to do that. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes. Noelle was lifted onto a stretcher, loaded into the vehicle, and taken straight to Cumberland County Hospital. Reed followed behind in his black car, the Mastiff on the seat beside him, Perry driving. No one said a word the entire way. When they arrived at the hospital, Noelle was taken directly into the emergency room. Reed stood in the hallway watching the doors close behind his sister's stretcher, then turned to Perry and spoke in a clipped voice. "A private room, the best doctor here, and have an orthopedic specialist come down from Baltimore today. Security at her door, 24 hours a day. No one gets in unless their name is on the list." Perry nodded, pulled out his phone, and began making calls. That was how Reed Lawson handled everything. He gave orders, waited for results, and paid for those results. He had never encountered a problem money couldn't solve. June was at the hospital too. No one had invited her to come along, but she had ridden in the ambulance with Noelle from the woods to this place, because when the paramedics asked who had treated the victim first and who could give detailed information, June was the only one with answers. She sat in the hallway on a plastic chair against the wall, still wearing the mud-stained clothes that had been soaked since the night before. Someone at the hospital had given her a thin blanket to drape around her shoulders, and a cup of coffee from the vending machine that she held in both hands for warmth but had not yet drunk. She sat there and waited, not because anyone had asked her to wait, but because she wanted to know whether the girl from the woods last night was going to be all right. That was all. Reed found her in the hallway about an hour after Noelle had been taken into the emergency room. He had changed his coat. Perry kept spare clothes in the car, and now he looked exactly like the man he was in Baltimore. Immaculate, controlled, without a trace of mud on him. He walked down the hallway toward June, the Mastiff close at his side, its nails striking a steady rhythm against the hospital tile. June looked up when she heard the footsteps. She looked at Reed coming closer, looked at the dog, then looked back at Reed. She did not stand. Reed stopped in front of her. He did not sit down. He stood there, looking down at her for a second, then slipped a hand into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a thick white envelope, and set it on the empty chair beside her. He did not say what it was, because both of them already knew what it was. June looked at the envelope on the chair, then she looked up at Reed. Her eyes were not curious, not surprised, not grateful. They simply looked straight at him, the kind of look from someone who was reading the person in front of her and had already finished reading before he even opened his mouth. She said, "You keep it." Her voice held no anger. It was not raised. It was not quieter than usual. It was only the ordinary voice of someone stating an ordinary truth. "I didn't stop my car because I wanted to be paid. I stopped because someone needed help. That's all." Reed stood there. The envelope remained on the chair. He kept looking at her for another moment, and in that stretch of silence, something happened that he was not used to, because in 15 years of running the Lawson Empire, everything had a price. Every favor came with a bill. Everyone wanted something, and he had never stood in front of a person holding a cup of vending machine coffee, wearing mud-stained clothes, who had just spent the entire night in the woods keeping his sister warm, then looked him in the face and said no to an envelope full of money without needing more than a second to think about it. He did not know how to respond, and it was the first time in a very long while that Reed Lawson had found himself in a situation for which he had no ready way to handle it. He picked the envelope up from the chair, slipped it back into his coat pocket, turned, and walked down the hallway toward Noelle's room. The Mastiff followed, its nails tapping steadily on the tile. Perry stood at the far end of the hallway, having seen the entire exchange from a distance. As Reed passed, Perry said quietly, "She didn't take the money." Reed did not look back. He did not answer. He kept walking. Perry watched him go, then turned his eyes toward June, still sitting in the plastic chair at the end of the hall, the thin blanket around her shoulders, the cup of coffee in her hands, her gaze fixed on the emergency room doors, waiting for news about someone whose name she had not even known before last night. 3 days later, Noelle was fully awake and clear-headed. Her left arm had been set in a cast. The wound on her forehead had been stitched and bandaged, and she had been moved from the emergency room to the private room Reed had arranged. The room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of the hallway, with someone standing outside the door 24 hours a day. A private nurse Perry had brought down from Baltimore, and fresh flowers on the bedside table, that no one knew Reed had ordered because he never mentioned the things he had done. Reed came to see Noelle on the afternoon of the third day. He sat in the chair beside her bed, the mastiff stretched out on the floor of the hospital room, and the two of them sat together in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that exists between two people who share blood but do not share the habit of talking. Reed asked if she needed anything. Noelle said no. Reed asked what the doctors had said. Noelle said her arm would recover completely. Her head injury was nothing serious, and she would be discharged in a few weeks. Reed nodded, then silence again. Then Noelle spoke, not in answer to any question, but because she had been thinking about this for the 3 days she had lain in that hospital bed, and had decided she would say it when he came. She looked out the window, not at Reed, and began in a soft voice, though every word was clear. I remember more than you think. That night, I wasn't unconscious the whole time. I woke up 4 times. She paused, still looking out the window. The first time, I didn't know where I was. All I knew was that it was dark and cold, and someone was holding my shoulder, speaking into my ear in a very calm voice, telling me I wasn't alone. The second time, I asked her who she was. She said she was someone passing by. I asked why she didn't go find help. She said because if she left, no one would keep me warm. The third time, I woke up near dawn. I looked at her. She was shaking from her shoulders all the way down to her feet. But she was still sitting there, still holding me, and her coat was wrapped around me instead of around herself. Noelle turned to look at Reed. Her eyes were not angry, not accusing. They were only the eyes of someone speaking a truth she knew would weigh heavily, but still needed to be spoken. 4 times I woke up. 4 times I saw her sitting there, a complete stranger, who didn't know who I was, didn't know my last name, wasn't being paid, wasn't asked by anyone, stopped her car on her own, climbed down there on her own, took off her coat on her own, and sat in the mud all night keeping me warm. She stopped, drew in a breath. All my life, no one has ever stayed with me like that. Not even you. The hospital room fell silent, a silence heavier than anything Noelle had just said. The mastiff on the floor lifted its head and looked at Reed, then at Noelle, then lowered its head again. The heart monitor beside the bed kept sounding its steady beep, beep, beep. The afternoon light came through the window and stretched across the hospital floor in a long pale band. Reed said nothing. His face did not change, or if it did, it changed in a place ordinary people could not see, somewhere behind those gray eyes, in the part of him he had spent 15 years learning how to seal shut. He rose from the chair. He did not say I'm sorry, because Reed Lawson did not say those words to anyone. He did not say I'll change, because he was not the kind of man who made promises. He said nothing at all. He walked toward the hospital room door, and when he reached the doorway, he stopped. 1 second. He did not turn back. He did not look at Noelle. He only stood there, his right hand resting against the doorframe, like a man who had just reached the edge of something and did not yet know whether he wanted to step across it. Then he kept going, out into the hallway. The mastiff followed. Perry was in the hallway, leaning against the wall across from the room, waiting. He looked at Reed's face when Reed stepped out and knew at once this was not the moment to ask how the visit had gone, not because Reed's face looked different, but because Reed's face looked exactly the way it always did, and Perry knew that when Reed held his expression that tightly in place, whatever was happening inside him was not ordinary at all. Perry said nothing. He only fell into step beside Reed down the hallway, into the elevator, out to the parking garage, into the car, and drove back to Baltimore in silence for more than 200 kilometers. The highway back to Baltimore at night was straight and empty, the orange streetlights moving across the car windows in a steady rhythm, like a count being marked off. Perry drove, Reed sat in the back seat, and the mastiff lay beside him. Reed looked out through the glass, but he did not see the road. He saw his father, Holt Lawson, the man who had built everything Reed was now sitting in, driving back to, owning. His father had once said something Reed first heard when he was 13 years old, sitting in the back seat of a car exactly like this one. The world is divided into 2 kinds, the ones who make the rules and the ones who obey them. The Lawsons make the rules. Reed had lived by that sentence for 20 years without ever questioning it. Until tonight, on this stretch of highway, when Noelle's words, "Not even you," were still sitting in the front seat of his mind and refused to get out of the car. His father had loved Noelle's mother. That was not speculation. It was something Reed had known since childhood, from the way his father spoke of her. Rarely, and with restraint. But still differently from the way he spoke of anyone else. His voice softer by the smallest degree, a difference only someone who listened often would notice. But Holt Lawson had not chosen her. He had chosen the marriage arranged by the family, chosen the wife who fit the position, chosen power instead of choosing the woman whose name softened his voice. Noelle's mother lived outside, supported regularly, but never allowed to walk through the front door of the main house. Noelle grew up outside the circle that carried the Lawson name, without ever being allowed to bear that name openly. And when his father died, Reed took responsibility for his sister in exactly the same way his father had. Sent money, kept his distance, called it protection. The orange streetlights swept across the windows again. Reed lowered his gaze to his hands, resting on his thighs. Hands like his father's, long, strong, fingered, the hands of a man accustomed to holding power. His father had used those hands to build an empire, to sign contracts, to hand over support money to the woman he loved but did not choose, and to place on Reed's shoulders a burden he had never once asked whether Reed wanted to carry. And on that empty highway, Reed realized that his father had applied the Lawson philosophy of making the rules even to love. He made rules about who was allowed to stay close, who had to remain far away, who was acknowledged, and who was left to live outside. And Reed was repeating it. He was not keeping Noelle far away for her safety. He was keeping her far away because it was easier for him, because if she stayed close, he would have to see the face that looked like her mother's every day, and that face would ask him questions he did not want to answer. Perry looked into the rearview mirror and saw Reed sitting motionless in the back seat, his eyes open but fixed on nothing. Perry did not ask anything. He only kept driving. The next morning, Reed sat at his desk in the office on the highest floor of the Lawson Maritime building. The Mastiff lay in the corner of the room, where it always lay every day. Reed called Perry in. Perry closed the door, stood in front of the desk, and waited. Reed said, "The nurse in Cumberland. Find out about her." Perry did not ask what for. He nodded and left the room. 4 hours later, Perry came back and placed a thin file on Reed's desk. Thin because there was not much to find. June Bellamy, 27 years old, orphaned young, raised in the foster care system, on her own since 18, currently working as a nursing assistant at the Cumberland Clinic, night shift, low pay, 2 months behind on rent. The clinic where she worked was under review for closure because of a lack of operating funds. No bad debt, no criminal record, no family, nothing except a job she was about to lose and a rented home she was about to be forced out of. Reed read the entire thin file in less than 2 minutes. Then he sat still, his hand resting on the last page, his eyes lowered but no longer reading. He sat still long enough for the Mastiff in the corner to lift its head and look at him once before laying it back down. Then Reed said, still looking at the file, "Pay off all her rent. However many months she owes. Pay that. And cover the next 6 months too. As for the clinic, find a medical funding foundation. Route the money through that. Enough to keep the place open for at least 1 year." Perry nodded. Reed looked up at him. "Through an intermediary company. Don't let the Lawson name appear. Don't let her know where the money came from." Perry nodded again. He did not ask why. He did not comment. He turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind him. Reed remained alone in the office. He had done what he had just done on instinct, the same instinct he had used for 15 years to solve every problem. If there was a problem, find out about it. Once you knew enough, spend the money. Once the money was spent, the problem disappeared. That was the way Reed Lawson's world worked, and it had never failed him. He did not stop to ask himself why that nurse was still in his mind after several days, why he had read that thin file more carefully than any financial report that week, why he had ordered money sent to a woman who had refused his money to his face. He did not ask, because Reed Lawson was not accustomed to asking himself questions whose answers did not fit neatly inside a file. A few weeks later, one afternoon after her shift, June came home and found an envelope from her landlord in the mailbox. She opened it, expecting to read another overdue notice, the kind she had grown used to receiving every month. But inside was not an overdue notice. It was a payment receipt. The 2 months of back rent had been paid in full, along with 6 months of rent in advance. 8 months of housing in total, paid in a single transaction, from the name of a company June had never heard of. She read the receipt twice, Then she called her landlord. He answered, sounding more cheerful than usual, and told her that someone had contacted him and paid everything in full, that he did not know exactly who, because it had all gone through an intermediary company, and that June did not need to worry about rent anymore, at least not for the next half year. June asked for the company's name. He read off a long name that June wrote down on the back of the envelope. Then she hung up. The next day, when she arrived at the clinic manager called her in and said that the clinic had just received funding from a medical foundation, enough to keep operations running for at least a year, that the closure order had been withdrawn, and that new medication and supplies would arrive the following week. June asked for the foundation's name. The manager gave her a name she had never heard before as well, but June did not need to hear anything more. 2 large payments, arriving at the same time, from names no one in Cumberland knew, both solving the 2 greatest problems in her life. That was not coincidence. That evening, June called Noelle. The 2 of them had stayed in touch since the night in the woods, not by speaking every day, but Noelle had called June when she was discharged from the hospital to thank her once again. Then June had asked how her arm was healing. Then Noelle had texted to ask whether June was exhausted after her shift, and it had simply continued from there, the kind of contact between 2 people who had shared a night together and did not need to explain anything further. June told Noelle about the rent money and the clinic funding. On the other end of the line, there was silence for a long moment. Then Noelle said, her voice soft but certain, "That sounds like something my brother would do." June did not ask any more questions. She did not need to. She hung up, sat at the kitchen table in her small rented home, looked at the receipt lying on the table, and felt something rise in her chest that was not gratitude. It was anger, the kind of anger belonging to someone who had spent her entire life standing on her own 2 feet, asking nothing from anyone, owing nothing to anyone, and then suddenly finding that someone had decided to help her without even asking whether she wanted to be helped at all. The following week, Reed came to Cumberland to visit Noelle. Noelle had already been discharged and was staying temporarily in a small apartment Reed had rented for her in town while she recovered. Reed drove there with Perry at the wheel and the Mastiff in the back seat as always. When the car stopped in front of the apartment building, Reed stepped out and saw June standing on the front steps by the door. She stood there like someone who had been waiting, both hands hanging at her sides, her eyes fixed directly on him. This was not the same look she had given him in the hospital corridor, that calm look that read a person through. This time there was fire in her eyes. Reed walked toward the entrance. The Mastiff moved at his side. When he came close enough for her to be heard clearly, June spoke. No greeting, no preamble. She went straight to it. "I know you paid my rent. I know you funded the clinic." Her voice did not shake. It was not loud, but every word landed heavier than the one before it. "I don't know how you're used to solving everything in Baltimore, but let me tell you how it is here. I'm not a file in one of your stacks of paperwork. I'm not a problem you solve by signing a check and forgetting about it. I'm not a charity project for you to use so you can feel like you're doing something good." She paused for a beat, drew in a breath, then continued. "If you really want to do something good, start with your own life. Don't use other people's lives to feel better about yourself." When she finished, she looked at Reed for one more second. Then she turned, stepped down from the front stoop, and walked along the sidewalk toward the clinic at the end of the street without looking back. Her footsteps were even, her back straight, the stride of someone who did not need to know whether the person behind her was watching or not. Reed stood there on the steps. The Mastiff sat by his foot, muzzle pointed toward June as she moved farther away, ears lifted, as though trying to understand why this woman was walking away without anyone having ordered her to go. Perry remained in the car, looking through the window, having heard enough through the open door. He said nothing. No one said anything. Reed stood there until June turned into the clinic entrance and disappeared from sight. Then he went into the building, up to Noelle's apartment, knocked on the door, and said nothing about the conversation that had just happened on the front steps. But when Noelle opened the door and looked at his face, she knew. She did not ask. The 2 of them sat together for half an hour, talking about her arm, about school, about things that did not matter, and through that entire half hour, Reed sat in the chair across from his sister, but his mind remained outside on the front steps, in the place where a 27-year-old nurse had just said to him the thing no one in the 15 years of his rule over the Lawson Empire had ever dared to say. Reed arrived back in Baltimore close to midnight. The entire drive of more than 200 kilometers, he did not say a single word. Perry drove, glancing into the rearview mirror a few times, seeing Reed in the back seat with the expression Perry had learned to read over more than 10 years of working beside him. It was not the face of a man who was sad, not the face of a man who was thinking. It was the face of a man who was angry and had not yet found a place to set that anger down. Perry knew that look, and he knew that when Reed brought that look back to the office, someone would bear the consequences. The only question was who. The next morning, Reed came into the office earlier than usual. The Mastiff followed him in and lay down in its usual corner. Reed sat at his desk, did not open his computer, did not review reports, did not call anyone. He simply sat. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. Then he pressed the internal call button. "Perry, come in." Perry entered, closed the door, and stood in front of the desk. Reed did not look up. He spoke in an even, cold voice. The voice Perry recognized as the one Reed used when giving an order that did not allow questions. The nurse in Cumberland. Find more information. Everything. Who she knows, who she owes, who she calls, where she goes after her shifts. Everything. Perry stood still for a moment. He did not nod the way he always did. He did not reach for his phone. He simply stood there, looking at Reed, and for the first time in a very long while, he asked back, "For what?" Reed lifted his gaze, looked at Perry. The two men held each other's eyes across the desk, and in that stretch of silence, the room was quiet enough to hear the Mastiff breathing in the corner. Reed did not answer the question, because he did not have an answer. He only knew that there was a nurse in a small town who had looked straight into his eyes and said to him the things that no one, not a single person in 15 years, had dared to say. And he did not know what to do with that. Reed Lawson always knew what to do. That was why he sat in this chair, at the head of this table, on the highest floor of this building. He always knew, and now he did not. And that not knowing made him angrier than any bad debt, angrier than any deal that had fallen apart. Perry looked at Reed for another moment. Then he spoke, not in the tone of an employee reporting to his employer, but in the tone of a man who had been beside Reed long enough to allow himself the right to speak plainly exactly once. She spoke straight to your face. In front of me. In front of Noelle. And you don't know what to do because you have never met anyone who spoke straight to you without wanting something from you. She doesn't want anything from you. She just told the truth. And you're sitting here at 6 o'clock in the morning telling me to go dig into her life. Perry paused, drew in a breath. For what? To take it out on the only person in 15 years who has dared to tell you the truth. The last line Perry spoke was not a question. It was a statement, and it remained in the room like a heavy object that had just been set down in the middle of the table. Reed looked at Perry, looked for a long moment, the kind of look that, if it had been anyone else in the Lawson organization, would have sent that person out of the room apologizing within seconds. But Perry was not anyone else. Perry was the only man in 15 years who knew what Reed Lawson's normal face looked like, and what his face looked like when it was hiding something else. And Perry knew that this was the second kind. Reed said 2 words. "Get out." There was no anger in his voice, no extra coldness, just 2 words spoken in the voice of a man who wanted to be alone. Perry nodded, turned, opened the door, stepped out, closed it softly behind him. Reed remained alone in the office. The Mastiff in the corner lifted its head to look at him, then set it down again. Outside the window, Baltimore was slowly growing brighter, early sunlight falling across the harbor below, where shipping containers stood in long rows along the docks. Reed did not look outside. He did not call Perry back. He did not give another order. He did not press the intercom button again. He did not open his computer. He did nothing at all. He only sat at the desk, both hands resting on the wood surface, and stayed there while the sunlight moved slowly across the floor, from the eastern window to the western wall, until the sky went dark again, and the room was left with only the city lights filtering in from outside. And Reed Lawson was still sitting in that same place, the dog still lying in that same corner, and neither of them had moved. In the weeks that followed, Reed Lawson still sat at the head of the table, still made decisions in seconds, still remained the name no one on the East Coast underworld wanted to hear twice. But something had shifted. Not large, not obvious, just enough that Perry noticed, because Perry was the only one who stood close enough to see. The first time was when a lower-level associate brought up a debt collection file, an old debt from a small shop owner in the outskirts of Baltimore, the kind of account Reed would once have approved for collection in 3 seconds, without reading the details. Reed opened the file, read it, then closed it, said, "Drop this one." The associate looked at him, not even having time to ask before Reed spoke again. "I said drop it." The associate nodded, took the file, and left. Perry stood in the corner of the room, watching him go, then looked at Reed. Reed did not look back. Perry did not ask. The second time was a shipment moving through the port, the kind Reed would normally greenlight immediately, but this time he asked to review the details again, asked more questions, then set it aside without making a decision. Reed Lawson had never set anything aside without deciding. Perry noticed, still did not ask, because Perry had worked beside Reed long enough to know that there were moments when questions did not help, and this was one of those moments. Something was happening inside Reed that Reed himself had not yet named, and Perry knew the best thing he could do was stand still and wait. Then came that night. About 3 weeks after the afternoon on the Cumberland steps, Reed received a call close to 10 o'clock at night. A major deal. The kind people in the underworld called a once-in-a-decade opportunity, because it came once and then disappeared. Cargo from overseas, moving through the port of Baltimore, needing one night to transfer, profit in the millions. Low risk, because the other side had already handled the customs. All Reed had to do was nod, have his people open the warehouse, and by morning the Lawson Maritime accounts would carry a number most people would never earn in a lifetime. Reed did not give his answer over the phone. He said he would come in person. That was the first sign of something unusual, because Reed never went to transaction points himself. That was work for the men below him. But that night he drove alone, did not call Perry, did not bring anyone with him, just him and the Mastiff in the back seat. The car moved through the city, past industrial zones, into the southern outskirts of Baltimore, where old warehouses lined the secondary docks, where the streetlights were fewer and the darkness was thicker. Reed parked at the end of an alley, about 50 meters from the steel door of the warehouse, turned off the engine, turned off the lights. The Mastiff in the back shifted its position, set its head on its front paws, breathing evenly. It was used to nights like this, used to sitting in a dark car, used to waiting, used to the silence of its owner when he was calculating. But tonight was different. The dog did not know how it was different, but it could feel it, because dogs sensed what people concealed, and what Reed was concealing tonight was not calculation. It was something else. Reed sat motionless, both hands on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the steel door ahead, the door behind which a deal worth millions was waiting for him to walk through. He knew there were people behind that door waiting for him. He knew that if he opened the car door and stepped out, everything would move exactly the way it always had. Money into accounts, cargo through the port, life continuing, and by morning he would be sitting again at the head of the table as he had for 15 years. He knew all of that. And he sat there. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. He did not open the car door. He did not step out. He did not call anyone. He simply sat, both hands on the wheel, staring at the steel door in the dark. Then he picked up his phone, dialed Perry. It rang 3 times. Perry answered, his voice alert, because Perry was the kind of man who never slept deeply while his phone was still on. Reed said 2 words. "Cancel it." Silence on the other end. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Then Perry asked, "Why?" Not in a challenging tone. In the tone of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, because Perry knew how big this deal was, and knew Reed never canceled anything without a reason heavier than what he was canceling. Reed looked down at his hands on the steering wheel. Hands like his father's. He had thought that on the highway weeks ago. Hands that had signed orders, held power, controlled countless outcomes. He looked at those hands in the darkness and said, "I don't know." Then he hung up. He sat there a while longer in the dark car, the Mastiff behind him breathing steadily. The steel door ahead still closed, the phone silent. Reed started the engine, backed out of the alley, and drove home. He did not look back at the door. That night, Reed Lawson returned to his penthouse apartment in Baltimore, took off his shoes, lay down on his bed, and slept. Not the kind of sleep he had known for 15 years, the kind where he closed his eyes for a few hours and woke at 3 o'clock in the morning with the feeling that something heavy was pressing on his chest without form. That night he slept straight through until morning, for the first time in a very long time, so long that he could not remember the last time it had happened. The Mastiff lay at the foot of the bed, breathing evenly. And if anyone had asked Reed Lawson the next morning why he had canceled a $1 million deal the night before, he would have given exactly the same answer he had given Perry on the phone, because it was the only truth he had. "I don't know." News of Reed canceling a $1 million deal spread through the Lawson organization faster than any shipment that had ever passed through the port of Baltimore. No one said it to his face, because no one dared say anything to Reed Lawson's face. But in late-night calls between mid-level enforcers, in half-finished remarks in parking lots after meetings, in the quick exchanged looks when Reed stepped out of a room, the question was then, as plain as a crack in a wall that everyone could see but no one had pointed to yet. The boss was different. First, there was the small debt he let go instead of collecting. Then there was the shipping deal he set aside without approving. Then there was the $1 million operation he personally drove to and personally called off. In 15 years, nothing like this had ever happened. People began to wonder. Wade was the first man who did not merely wonder, but began looking for answers. Wade oversaw the debt collection arm of the Lawson organization and was the highest-ranking enforcer after Perry. But he differed from Perry in one essential way. Perry was loyal to Reed, Wade was loyal to the Empire, and when the Empire began to show signs of shaking, Wade did not look at the foundation. He looked at the man standing on top of it. He began to watch Reed, not in any loud way, because Wade was not a loud man, just a car parked at a distance from the Lawson Maritime office every afternoon, logging the hour Reed left for the day. A man stationed in the lobby of Reed's penthouse building, recording the hour Reed came home. Small pieces, assembled slowly. And the most important piece was Cumberland. Wade discovered that Reed drove to Cumberland 3 times in 2 weeks, each trip there and back in a single day. More than 400 kilometers round trip to a small town in the Appalachian Mountains, where the Lawson organization had no operations, no deals, and no partners of any kind. The first time, Wade thought perhaps Reed was expanding territory. The second time, he began to suspect something else. The third time, Wade sent someone in Cumberland to watch, and that man reported back that Reed Lawson, the man whose name the entire East Coast underworld only needed to hear once, was parking outside a small clinic at the end of the town's main road, sitting on a bench out front, talking to a nurse with no bodyguards beside him. At that point, Wade did not know who the nurse was, but he knew how to find out, and he did. A week later, Reed walked into his office in the morning, the Mastiff at his side as always, and saw a brown envelope on his desk with no sender's name on it. The envelope had not come through the mail, not through reception, not through a secretary. It was lying on Reed's desk, which meant someone had placed it there by hand, and that someone had the authority to enter Reed's office before Reed arrived. The list of people with that authority was very short. Reed looked at the envelope, sat down in his chair. The Mastiff settled into the corner of the room. Reed opened the envelope. Inside were 3 photographs and a small note. The first photograph showed June Bellamy standing in front of the clinic, wearing her nursing uniform, her hair tied back neatly, locking the door after her shift. The second showed June walking along the sidewalk near her home, carrying a grocery bag in one hand. The third showed June sitting in her old car on the mountain road, seen through the windshield, the angle taken from another car driving behind her. 3 photographs, 3 different moments, 3 different angles. They were not accidental pictures. They were the photographs of someone who had spent time watching, waiting, and pressing the shutter at the precise moment so the person receiving them would understand. I know where she is. I know where she goes. I know who she is to you. The small note was tucked beneath the last photograph. Handwritten, the strokes even and familiar. The boss should focus on business. No signature. No signature needed. Reed recognized Wade's handwriting. Reed set the 3 photographs down on the desk, arranging them neatly side by side. Then he placed the note on top of them. His face did not change. His eyes were still the same cold gray eyes the conference room was accustomed to seeing. Not a single muscle moved. But his right hand, the one resting on the edge of the desk, tightened, slowly. His fingers pressed into the wood, clenching harder and harder, until the knuckles turned white. The Mastiff in the corner lifted its head and looked at its master, ears rising. It sensed what Reed's face showed no one. Reed sat there, looking at the 3 photographs on the desk, and for the first time in a very long while, he did not think about the Lawson Empire, did not think about deals, did not think about money. He thought about a nurse driving alone on a mountain road in the 3rd photograph, and about the fact that she had no idea someone had been photographing her from behind. The next day, Reed drove to Cumberland, alone. He did not call Perry, did not bring anyone with him, did not tell anyone in the organization. just him and the mastiff in the back seat. That was something that had never happened in 15 years. Because Reed Lawson never went anywhere alone, not because he was afraid, but because a man in his position did not go anywhere alone as a matter of principle, as a matter of how things operated, as a matter of instinct. But that morning, after sitting and staring at the 3 photographs on his desk all night, Reed understood that what he needed to do next was not something anyone in the Lawson organization could come with him to do. He arrived in Cumberland in the late afternoon, parked in front of the clinic, in the same place he had parked the previous times, but this time he did not go inside. He stood leaning against the body of the car, both hands in his trouser pockets, the mastiff sitting by his right leg, and waited. He knew what time June got off shift. He knew because he had come enough times to know, and that was the kind of thing Reed Lawson did not want to think too carefully about why he knew. June came out of the clinic door 15 minutes later. She saw him immediately, because it was hard not to notice an expensive black car parked in front of a small clinic in a town like this, and even harder not to notice a 70-kilogram dog sitting on the sidewalk beside a man in a suit leaning against the car. June stopped on the front step, looked at Reed, looked at the dog. Her face was not angry the way it had been the last time on the front stoop. It was not cold the way it had been in the hospital corridor. It was only the face of someone waiting to hear the reason before deciding whether she wanted to hear anything further. She said, "What do you need?" It was not a question. It was a demand for a quick answer. Reed looked at her, said, "To talk." June looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, 5 minutes. She walked over to the bench in front of the clinic, the old wooden bench where patients usually sat to wait, and sat down. Reed pushed himself away from the car, walked over, and sat at the other end of the bench, about an arm's length away from June. The mastiff lay down at Reed's feet, head resting on its front paws, eyes half closed. Reed did not speak right away. He sat there for a while, looking out at the town's main road, where a few cars moved slowly through the fading light. Then he began to speak. He did not look at June. He looked straight ahead at the road. He said that his father had left him a life's work he had never once been asked whether he wanted to take on, that he had done that work for 15 years, and in those 15 years he had made decisions he knew were wrong, but made them anyway, because he did not think he had any other choice, that the work was the kind no one asked details about and no one wanted to know details about, that he was good at that work, and that being good at it was the worst part of all, because it meant he never had to ask himself what exactly he had been doing for 15 years. That he had a sister whom he had kept far away her whole life because he told himself it was to protect her. But the truth was that he did not know how to be close to someone without controlling them. That a few weeks earlier he had canceled a deal worth millions of dollars, and when people asked him why, he said he did not know, and that had been the truth. He really did not know. He said all of those things in an even voice, neither fast nor slow, the voice of a man speaking aloud things he had never said to anyone before, not because he was suddenly braver than he had been, but because he had run out of room to keep them inside. June sat and listened. She did not interrupt. She did not nod. Nothing in her expression changed from beginning to end. She listened the way she listened to patients at the clinic when they described their symptoms, attentive, patient, not judgmental, and smart enough to understand what was not being said between the sentences. Reed did not say a single word about the Underworld, did not speak of the true nature of Lawson Maritime, did not speak of the deals, or the money, or the people he had affected over 15 years, but June did not need him to say it. She had seen the search team in the woods that night. She had seen the way Perry took orders. She had seen the envelope of money. She had seen her rent paid through a nameless company. She knew enough to understand, and she was wise enough not to need him to spell out every letter. When Reed finished speaking, silence sat down between the two of them on the bench in front of the clinic. The mastiff breathed steadily at their feet. The evening light stretched long across the sidewalk. June sat still for a long while, long enough that Reed began to think she would stand up and go back into the clinic without saying anything. Then she spoke. Her voice was different from the other 2 times, not cold the way it had been in the hospital corridor, not angry the way it had been on the front stoop. It was the calm voice of someone speaking to another person with truth, not with emotion. "You're telling me these things because you want me to forgive you, or because you want to hear someone tell you the truth about where you are." Reed was silent for a moment. Then he said, "The second one." June gave a small nod, as though that was the answer she had expected, and if he had said the first one, she would have stood up and walked away. "Then I'll speak plainly." She turned to look at him for the first time since the two of them had sat down on the bench, dark brown eyes looking straight into gray ones. "You're not a monster, but you're living as though you don't have any other choice. As though the road you're on is the only road there is, because your father put you on it, and you never once asked yourself whether you could turn onto another one." She paused for a beat. "But you can. You always could." Those last 6 words remained there on the bench between them like something that had been set down gently, yet could not be lifted again by anyone. Reed did not answer. He did not nod. He did not argue. He only sat there, looking out at the main road growing darker, the mastiff at his feet, and those 6 words lying between them. Reed drove back to Baltimore that night. He did not sleep. The next morning, he was in the office at 6 o'clock, before everyone else, sitting at his desk, opening his phone and calling Perry. He said 4 words. "Internal meeting. Today." Perry was silent for a second, then asked, "Who needs to be there?" Reed said, "Everyone, including Wade." Perry did not ask anything more. He hung up and began making calls. But before the meeting took place, there was another conversation in Reed's office that no one knew about except the 2 men inside the room. Perry arrived half an hour before everyone else, closed the door, placed a thick file case on Reed's desk, one Reed had never seen before. Perry said, "I knew you'd need this, so I prepared it ahead of time." Reed opened the file case. Inside was detailed evidence that Wade had been skimming money from the organization for 3 years. Transfers routed through personal offshore accounts, not a small amount, broken into many smaller transactions to avoid detection. But Perry had pieced them together one by one, transaction by transaction, number by number, into a complete picture no one could deny. Reed read through it, looked up at Perry. Perry said, "I've been watching Wade for 2 years. Not because you asked me to, because I knew sooner or later you'd need it." Reed looked at Perry for another moment, then closed the file case and nodded once. That was enough. Between 2 men who had worked beside each other for more than 10 years, a single nod was enough. The meeting began at 10 in the morning. The conference room on the top floor, the dark wood table, the same room where a few months earlier Reed had sat at the head of the table listening to Perry's report when the news came that Noel had disappeared. Today the table was fuller. 8 men, all the highest-ranking operators in the Lawson organization, the ones who ran each division from shipping to finance to collections. Wade sat in the middle of the table on the left side, leaning back in his chair, both hands resting on the armrests, the posture of a man who was comfortable because he believed he held the upper hand. He had sent the envelope of photographs to Reed, and Reed had shown no reaction, and in Wade's mind, that meant Reed had understood the message and would return to where he belonged. Wade watched Reed walk into the conference room, the mastiff moving close at his heel and lying down beneath the head of the table in the exact place it always lay, and Wade thought everything was about to return to normal. Reed stood at the head of the table. He did not sit down. He stood. That was the first unusual thing, because Reed always sat. Perry stood in the corner of the room behind Reed, the thick file case in his hand. Reed looked around the table, looked at each man one by one, pausing on each face for exactly a second, then began to speak. "I have a few numbers I want everyone to hear." He signaled to Perry. Perry stepped forward, opened the file case, and handed a copy to each man. The room fell silent as the 8 men opened the documents and began to read. Reed did not need to read, because he already knew every number by heart. He simply stood there and watched each face as they read, watched their eyes move across the lines of figures, and watched Wade's expression change. It did not change quickly. It changed slowly, from comfortable to puzzled, from puzzled to recognition, from recognition to pale shock. Wade finished the first page, turned to the second, and by the 3rd page his hand no longer held the paper steadily. Reed spoke, his voice even, neither raised nor lowered, the same voice he used when making decisions in the weekly meetings. 3 years, 17 transfers. A total amount I won't read aloud here because I think Mr. Wade knows it better than I do. Reed looked at Wade. Wade opened his mouth, beginning to say something. Reed lifted one hand. It was not a forceful gesture. He simply raised his hand, palm outward, gently, and Wade stopped speaking in the middle of the sentence. Because in this room, when Reed Lawson raised his hand, people stopped talking, no matter what they had been saying. You have 24 hours to disappear from anything connected to the Lawson name, Reed said, still in that even voice. After 24 hours, this file goes where it needs to go. He did not explain where that place was. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood. Wade looked at Reed, looked at Perry, looked around the table for an ally and found no one looking back at him. He stood up, shoved his chair backward, walked out of the conference room without saying a word, without looking at anyone. The door shut behind Wade, and the sound of that door closing was the last sound the name Wade ever made inside the Lawson Maritime building. Reed waited until the door had fully closed. Then he spoke again, still standing, still in that same even voice. There's one more announcement. The conference room looked at him. Lawson Maritime, starting today, will cut all operations outside the law. All of them. He paused long enough for the sentence to sink into every man. The company will operate completely legally. Shipping, logistics, warehousing. Anyone who wants to stay with the legal company stays. Anyone who doesn't has 1 week to make arrangements. He turned his gaze toward Perry. Perry will be COO. The room fell silent. Not the silence of agreement or the silence of protest. It was the silence of 8 men trying to understand that the world they knew had changed in 10 minutes, and none of them had been asked for their opinion first. But no one opened his mouth to object. Because Reed Lawson was still standing at the head of the table, the Mastiff was still lying at his feet, and every person in that room knew the man held enough secrets in his hands to bury any one of them, and if he had decided to turn, then the new direction was the only direction there was. The Mastiff at Reed's feet let out one long yawn, then lowered its head again. It had lain in this exact place in this conference room many times before. The first time, when Reed was the head of an underground empire. This time, when Reed had decided he would no longer be the head of that empire. The dog could not tell the difference between those 2 moments. It only knew that its master was standing, and it was lying at his feet, and that was enough. Noelle came to Cumberland on a weekend afternoon, a few days after the meeting in Baltimore. Her left arm was out of the cast now, wrapped only in a light bandage, and she drove down from school alone, this time taking the main road, not the mountain pass. She called June ahead of time and asked if she was free to get coffee. June said her shift ended at 3 o'clock. Noelle said she would wait. The 2 of them sat in a small cafe at the head of the street, facing each other across a narrow table. Noelle ordered coffee with milk. June ordered black coffee. They did not talk like 2 people getting to know each other, because they had passed that stage on the night in the woods, the night Noelle had lain in June's arms, while June kept her warm until morning. A bond like that did not need many meetings to prove itself. Noelle asked June about the clinic. June answered briefly. Noelle asked if June was tired. June said she was used to it. Then Noelle fell silent for a while, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, and began to speak about Reed. She said that her brother had sent money into her account every month without fail ever since their father died. But he had never once called to ask what she was studying, what she was painting, what she was thinking. She said she had discovered the GPS in her car a year ago, when she took it in for repairs, and the mechanic showed her the small device fixed underneath the chassis. She knew immediately who had put it there without needing to ask. She said her brother was the kind of man who showed concern by controlling things, because that was the only way he knew how. Sending money instead of making a phone call, installing a GPS instead of asking if she was all right, renting the best hospital room instead of sitting at her bedside and holding her hand. He wasn't a man who was stingy with feeling. He was a man who didn't know how to spend it. Noelle looked down at her coffee. Then she spoke again, her voice softer this time. He isn't a bad man. He's a man no one ever gave permission to be good. My father taught him that strength meant control. No one ever taught him that strength could also mean letting go. June sat across from her, both hands around her cup of black coffee. She said nothing. She did not nod. She did not comment. She only listened, with those dark brown eyes Noelle had seen 4 times in the rain that night, and every time had found the same thing there, the calm of someone who was used to staying when everyone else walked away. Then June asked, "Are you angry with him?" It was not the voice of someone asking out of curiosity. It was the voice of someone who truly wanted to know the answer, because that answer touched something she herself had been wondering. Noelle thought for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, but anger is different from giving up." June gave a small nod. A small, slow nod. The kind a person gives after hearing something she has known for a long time, but has never heard anyone say out loud. Anger is different from giving up. She knew that. She had lived that truth for 27 years. The two of them sat a little longer in the small cafe, finished their coffee, and said nothing more about Reed. Noelle asked June if she liked drawing. June said she didn't know how to draw. Noelle said no one knows how to draw until they begin. June almost smiled. A few months after that meeting, Lawson Maritime was still standing. It had not collapsed, the way some of the men in that conference room had quietly assumed it would. It had not exploded into growth the way it had back when it ran both sides of the business. It was simply standing, in the way a company stands when it cuts away more than half its revenue and still tries to keep moving on what remains. Revenue had dropped by more than half compared to before. Some of the old people left in the first week, quietly, with no farewells, because in that world people don't say goodbye when they leave. Some former clients stopped calling, because the kind of cargo they needed moved was not the kind a legal Lawson Maritime could take. But the company kept going. Perry sat in the COO position, handling operations each day with the precision of a man who had once managed something far larger, and now only had to pour that same level of energy into something smaller, but cleaner. Reed still sat at the head of the table, still wore suits, still made decisions in seconds. The conference table was still the same dark wood table, but there were fewer chairs, and the men sitting in them now were the ones who had stayed by choice rather than fear. Reed began hiring new people, and his hiring list made Perry frown for the first time in many months. Not because the people being hired lacked ability, but because every file shared one thing in common. The first man had served 4 years in prison for an offense related to transport, got out, and found that no place would hire him, so Reed put him in the position of port warehouse manager. The second man had served 6 years, came out knowing how to drive heavy trucks, but no transport company would sign a contract with a man who had a record, so Reed signed one. The third, the fourth, the fifth, each with a different situation, but with the same result in the outside world, that no one was willing to give them a second chance. Perry waited until the 5th file had been approved, then went into Reed's office, closed the door, and stood in front of the desk. The mastiff in the corner lifted its head to look at Perry, then lowered it again. It was used to this by now, Perry said. I'm not objecting, but I want to understand. Why do you keep hiring people with criminal records? Reed was signing papers at his desk. He did not look up. He said, because no one gives them a second chance, and I know what that feels like. His pen kept moving across the page. Perry stood there another moment, watching Reed sign, then nodded, turned, and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He did not ask anything more, because that answer was enough, and because Perry knew Reed Lawson was not the kind of man who spoke more than necessary, and when he said one sentence, that sentence was everything he intended to say. Lawson Maritime opened a small branch in Cumberland 3 months after the meeting. The office rented the ground floor of an old building near the river dock, many times smaller than the Baltimore headquarters, but enough to give Reed a legitimate reason to come to this town every week without having to explain himself to anyone. Perry knew the real reason. Reed knew. Perry knew. Neither of them mentioned it. Each time he came to Cumberland, Reed stopped by the clinic when June finished her shift. The first time he came after an afternoon at the branch office, he parked in front of the clinic and stood leaning against the car waiting, just as he had before. June came out, looked at him, looked at the mastiff sitting on the sidewalk, then said, "You again." Reed said, "I have an office here now." June looked at him for one more second, as if weighing whether she believed him, then walked over to the bench in front of the clinic and sat down. Reed sat at the other end. The mastiff lay at his feet, and they talked. That was how it began. There was no invitation to a date, no message asking, "When are you free?" No flowers, no gifts, none of the things ordinary people would call courtship. It was simply that Reed came to Cumberland, finished his work at the branch, stopped by the clinic, sat down on the bench, and the two of them talked until dark. The next week it happened again, and the week after that, again. Neither of them named what was happening, because perhaps neither of them yet knew what it was, or knew but was not ready to say it aloud, or simply did not need to say it, because the act of sitting there every week had already said enough. June talked about the clinic, about a new patient, an elderly woman living alone up in the pass who had fallen and broken her hip, and no one knew until the mail carrier discovered her. About a difficult case the week before, a child with a dangerously high fever at midnight, whose parents had no car to get to the county hospital, so they ran on foot carrying him to the clinic, about how medicine was still in short supply, though less than before, and about the blood pressure machine that she had finally fixed herself with a replacement button she bought online for $3. Reed listened. He did not offer to buy a new machine. He did not offer more funding. He did not offer anything at all. He simply listened. He had learned that lesson already. Reed talked about the company, about the small shipping contracts he would once have ignored, but which now formed the backbone of their revenue, about a new client, a seafood company from the Gulf region, that needed frozen cargo moved north. Not a large contract, but a steady one. About Perry having to do 3 times the work because staffing was thin, but not complaining, because Perry never complained. June listened. She did not advise. She did not say, "You should do this," or "You should try that." She listened the way she always listened. Attentive, patient, and respectful enough not to turn an equal conversation into a consultation. The Mastiff grew used to her. During the first few weeks, it still lifted its head when June came close, ears raised, nose drawing in her scent. But after a few times, it stopped reacting. June sat down on the bench, and the dog did not lift its head. June stood and walked away, and the dog did not follow her with its eyes. It had placed her on the list of people who did not need watching, and for Reed Lawson's dog, that was the highest acceptance anyone could receive. One evening, when the light was fading and the two of them had sat on the bench longer than usual, June asked, "Do you miss your old life?" Reed did not answer right away. He looked out at the main road, where the streetlights were beginning to come on one by one, then said, "I don't miss the old life. I miss the feeling of knowing exactly who I was. Now I don't know who I am." He said it in an ordinary voice, not sad, not regretful, only the truth spoken in the voice of a man who was growing used to telling the truth instead of saying what other people wanted to hear. June looked at him. Then she said, "That's a good sign." Reed turned and looked at her, his brow tightening slightly, not understanding yet. June continued, her voice soft, her eyes on the streetlights. "People who know exactly who they are usually the ones who have stopped changing." Reed did not answer, but he stayed sitting there a little longer before standing up, longer than usual. And when he drove back to the branch office that night, the Mastiff lying in the back seat, he drove more slowly than usual, like a man who was in no hurry to return to the place he was headed, because the place he had just left was still holding something of his on that bench in front of the small clinic at the end of the road. One Thursday afternoon, Noelle appeared in the lobby of the Lawson Maritime Building in Baltimore without warning. Reception called up to the office. Perry answered, glanced over at Reed. Reed nodded. Perry told them to send her up. Noelle walked into the office, her hair tied back neatly, her left hand still bearing the faint scar from that night on the mountain pass, though it now moved normally. The Mastiff in the corner lifted its head to look at her, wagged its tail once, then lowered its head again. Noelle did not sit. She stood in front of Reed's desk, holding an old envelope, the kind of paper envelope whose edges had yellowed with age, preserved carefully, but clearly carried through many years. She set the envelope on the desk and pushed it gently toward Reed. "I've kept this letter for a long time," Noelle said, her voice calm but slower than usual, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this sentence many times in her head before coming here. "My mother wrote it for me before she died. I've read it many times, but there's one part she didn't write for me. She wrote it about you." She paused. "I think it's time you read it." Reed looked at the envelope on the desk. He did not pick it up right away. He looked at it for a while, at the yellowed edge of the paper, the faded handwriting on the front, Noelle's name written in blue ink that had grown pale with time. Then he picked it up. Noelle turned and walked to the door, not waiting for him to read it. She knew there were some things that needed to be read alone. Reed opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pages of handwriting, small, even script, the careful penmanship of someone who knew she was writing something that would be kept longer than she herself would remain. Most of the letter was Noelle's mother, speaking to her daughter, telling her to live strong, but not hard, telling her not to hate her father, because he loved both of them in the only way he knew how. And that way was not enough, but that did not mean it was not real, telling her to draw often, because drawing was a way to speak the things the mouth could not say, telling her to remember that her mother was not sad, only regretful, and regret was different from sadness, because regret still carried gratitude for what had been. Then came the final line. Standing alone at the bottom of the second page, separated from the paragraph above, by a small empty space, as though the woman writing it had stopped to think before adding one last thing. Tell your brother that I have always known there is a better man in him than the one he believes himself to be. I only regret that I won't be there to see that man step forward. Reed read that line, read it again, then sat still. Outside the window, the port of Baltimore was still running, containers still stacked, forklifts still moving, the world still turning in the rhythm it had always kept. Reed folded the letter carefully, along the old crease lines, slid it back into the envelope, and placed the envelope inside his suit jacket. He did not leave it on the desk. He did not put it into a drawer. He slipped it into the inner pocket, close to his chest, where he would feel it every time he leaned forward. Then he pulled the stack of paperwork closer, picked up his pen, and returned to work. Perry came into the office 2 minutes later, holding a set of contracts that needed signing. He placed them on the desk and stood waiting. Reed signed them, page 1, page 2, page 3. Perry watched Reed's hand holding the pen, and he noticed that something was different. Not the content being signed, not the speed of the signing. It was the way Reed held the pen. Lighter. Reed held the pen more lightly than usual, the way a man does after setting down something very heavy that he has carried for a long time, and now his hands have grown lighter by just enough for someone standing close to notice. Perry said nothing. He picked up the signed contracts, nodded once, turned, and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. And if anyone had asked Perry whether anything unusual had happened that afternoon, he would have said no, nothing at all, because Perry was the kind of man who kept what he saw to himself, especially the important things. 2 years later, on a Saturday morning in early autumn, Reed Lawson and June Bellamy stood facing each other in the marriage registration room of Cumberland City Hall in Maryland. The room was small, the ceiling low, the light coming in through a single window overlooking the town's main street. There were no large floral arrangements, no orchestra, no long guest list. There was Perry standing in the corner, arms folded, smiling for the first time that day, and perhaps for the first time that month. There was Noelle standing beside June, her eyes already red before the ceremony had even begun, holding a small bouquet she had cut herself from the garden behind her studio. There were a few people from the clinic, the ones who had worked with June long enough to know that if June Bellamy invited someone to her wedding, it was because she truly wanted that person there, not because of politeness. June was dressed simply, in a white button-down shirt worn loose over her trousers, her hair tied neatly back the way it always was on workdays. Reed wore a suit, because Reed always wore a suit, and if there were ever a day when he did not wear one, that would be the day Perry called a doctor. On Reed's left wrist, his father's mechanical watch was still there. 2 simple silver rings, the ones Noelle had chosen, lay on the table in front of the registrar. June kept the Bellamy name. Reed did not ask why. He did not suggest changing it. He did not press, because he had learned, through 2 years of sitting on the bench outside the small clinic talking with this woman, that June Bellamy kept what was hers, and that was not a lack of love but a sign of self-respect, and those 2 things had never canceled each other out. 2 years had changed many things in Cumberland. Noelle had graduated from art school and opened a small studio at the top of the street, 3 storefronts away from the clinic. June's clinic now had 2 new staff members, and enough medicine for the whole year. Not because of Reed's money, but because June had sat down and written a grant application herself through the state community health program, rewriting it 3 times until it was approved, with the same 2 hands she had used to keep Noelle warm in the nighttime woods more than 2 years earlier. Reed knew about the grant application. He said nothing. He made no comment. He simply knew and left it alone, because he had come to understand that respecting June meant letting her do for herself the things she was able to do for herself, and only being beside her when she needed him, not when he wanted to step in. The Cumberland branch of Lawson Maritime was still running, small, earning just enough profit. 14 employees, 7 of them former convicts who had served their time and whom no other company would take. Men whose job applications were met everywhere else with a shake of the head, but with Reed's nod. Once Noelle asked him why he did that. Reed thought for a moment, then said, "It isn't about making up for anything. It's just the right thing I know how to do now." Noelle looked at him, then smiled. The kind of smile she had never smiled at him before the night on the mountain pass. The smile of someone who had forgiven, not because she had forgotten, but because she understood. Late that afternoon, after the ceremony, after the small lunch at the cafe at the head of the street where June and Reed had sat and talked hundreds of times, After Perry had shaken Reed's hand and driven back to Baltimore, because Perry was the kind of man who never stayed too long at a celebration. After Noelle had hugged June one last time and walked back to her studio, Reed stood at the window of the Cumberland branch office looking out over the parking lot below. The late sunlight slanted gold across the pavement. Then June's old car turned into the lot. She stepped out, still wearing the white shirt, her hair still tied neatly back, and the Neapolitan Mastiff came out from the ground floor office to meet her. The dog was much older now, moving more slowly, muzzle gone silver, the skin around its eyes folded more deeply than before. But it still went out to greet June every time she came, because that was what it had done for a very long time now, ever since the day it caught the scent leading down into the roadside ditch and found her sitting in the mud, keeping a stranger warm. June bent down, rubbed the dog's head, said something softly that Reed could not hear from up here, then went inside. Reed turned back to his desk. On the desk, beside the stack of papers and the pen he had now grown used to holding more lightly, stood a photograph in a small wooden frame. The picture showed 3 people sitting on the bench outside the clinic. Noelle on the left, laughing, one hand resting on the head of the Mastiff sitting between them. June on the right, not smiling, but with peaceful eyes, those dark brown eyes looking straight into the camera, with the gaze of someone who had found where she belonged without needing anyone's permission. On the back of the photograph, written in Noelle's small, careful hand, was a single line. Family isn't what you're born into. Family is what you choose to stay for. If this story touched something inside you, please press like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you can stay with us for the stories that come next. And tell me in the comments which moment in this story stayed in your mind the longest. We always read every comment, and each time we do, we feel again that these stories are not only stories, but threads that tie hearts together. Thank you for being here, for listening, for sharing. I wish everyone watching this video very good health, a day filled with joy and peace. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.